Grant Shapps is the new Defence Secretary. He is known for being the most tech-savvy MP. He spoke to us on Jimmy's Jobs at the start of the year about ChatGPT, hydrogen planes, flying a drone, and his rather strong views on TikTok. Wait until you hear what he describes it as. Here are the highlights.
What TikTok does actually is appeals to people's sort of voyeuristic nature. You can kind of have a look in, and because the style of a TikTok tends to be a selfie as well, it's sort of like, what is it like to be a bit inside that person's world? And I think that's quite quite useful. So yeah, I think it's a bit more personal, and I always think TikTok's a bit like social media on crack. You know, it's very hard once you start flicking through to stop. Kind of maybe the next video will be interesting. Maybe the next one. And I think it draws people in. Pluses and minuses to that. I think though the politicians need to be where people's eyes are. And that actually a lot of people are making the mistake of not going where people are actually, looking and reading and hearing these days. The simple answer is you just want to be everywhere, right? You would certainly want to have an email list. You want to have a website. Website's actually probably the least important of all of these things right now. You definitely want to have, in politics, Twitter, because although it's quite sort of Westminster and stuff, it is just a quick way of getting news out. It circumvents newsroom and press notes and stuff because you can just say something directly. And then, if you're on those, you might as well be on Instagram. I personally find TikTok is very engaging with a fraction of... So I think probably on Twitter, I probably have a following of, I think last time, like 178,000 or something. But on TikTok, 13 or 14,000, but I probably get more mentions from people. It's reaching a different audience. It's more interactive. It's more personable than anywhere else. I was at Poly. It's now would be called a university. It's at Manchester Met. I was only there for a couple of years, so I didn't do a degree, and don't actually have any A levels either. So I went and studied a BTEC and then another BTEC essentially. But I found all of that was just sort of great in terms of my entrepreneurial desire. Both my BTECs were in business and finance. If that was today, I would almost certainly do something in tech. Almost certainly. And I'm slightly surprised I didn't even back then. I was using, I had, PC, I was using computers. So even back then, I'm slightly surprised I didn't. Now it would definitely be tech, maybe an AI, or which I think is kind of a really interesting field. Britain's got a great lead in that area. Yeah, one was when I was 20, actually, which was the car crash, and one was when I was 30, which was the cancer. So I kind of, as I reached my those sort of landmark birthdays, start to get slightly worried. So how did it affect me? Actually, I think surprisingly little. People like sometimes people say, well, was it being in a car crash and being in a coma that made you wake up and think you got to kind of take control of your life, or follow your heart and dream, and in my case, go into public service. This is what I wanted to do. But the actual truth is, I already wanted to go into public service. I'd actually, just the week before the car crash, been selected for my very first ever public election, which was actually to the local council in Manchester, Withington constituency, but in a ward called Old Moat. My slogan was, put the new into Old Moat. So it actually took me 5 times before I won an election. But I don't think either the car crash or 10 years later... I had Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I was like a year of chemotherapy and radiotherapy, and it was a pretty dark time. I can remember once or twice in hospital up in the middle of the night and just thinking, you just go from living at, 100 miles an hour, getting on. I built my business up. I've met and married my wife, Belinda, and we hadn't had kids yet, but, we were just starting to think about all this. And then suddenly cancer, your world, it's like hitting a wall at 100 miles an hour. Came through the other side. A year later, I was kind of fixed, and I've been fine since. Why haven't we produced the next Google or Apple or Amazon or, choose your company? Why is that happening elsewhere? And in a sense, actually, it's a bit of a riddle. I can tell you. I'll tell you why, if that's helpful. Yeah. Well, this is why it's a riddle in my mind. First of all, we've clearly got the entrepreneurship. Yeah. We've got the drive. We've got the ideas. We're brilliant at the research and development. We're fantastic at coming up with sometimes completely revolutionary ideas. We I think, file more patents than anywhere else outside the US. We have more Nobel Prize winners than anywhere else outside the US.
More unicorns.
Unicorns which are these, clarification, billion pound companies than France and Germany and the Netherlands put together. We're the only economy in the world that has a $1 trillion tech economy. Only one of three, America, China and us. So we've got these massive advantages, but it doesn't stop there. We've got English, which is the language of business, which is pretty helpful. We've got a fantastic time zone. We've got, I can see it out the window here. Maybe your viewers who are watching, right? We've got the city just over there. This is one of two great financial centres of the entire world right here. So scale up finance should be possible as well. I just think the advantages go on and on and on and on. So how is it we don't quite get from the medium, very impressive business to the global, business of the future that everyone knows? I do something called the national security investment decisions. So this is where typically a foreign company might be buying a British company or partnering with it. And I see so much of that coming out of our universities. Now, I think this is a good thing. It means we are selling. I don't think we should have an open economy. We should allow people to come and buy our ideas and concepts and businesses. But I also want to see some of them grow up here as well. We're going to have to invent a way of flying around the world without damaging it, right? And I have a real interest in this, both because I happen to be a pilot and I'm really interested in aviation, but also because the constituency I represent is Welwyn Hatfield, and Hatfield is the home of the commercial jet engine. So the first place in the world to create and produce and R&D create and produce a commercial jet engine in a plane called the Comet. And so wouldn't it be brilliant if Britain was the next place to create zero carbon flight, jet zero flight, or guilt-free flying, as I like to term it? Tomorrow's 7th Jet Zero Council brings together exactly what you just said: the government, academia, and the industry, to try and fix this problem. And we're making real progress. So just people won't necessarily know this, but in the last couple of months, we've had the first flights of hydrogen aircraft, emitting no dangerous hydrocarbons and greenhouse gases. And so we can do this. And I think the convening power of government to create those jobs of the future and industries of the future is really important. Entrepreneurs need to inspire themselves to some degree by probably listening and watching and listening to great podcasts like Jimmy's Jobs of the Future or something. In my case, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, who was a US president who sort of invented this idea, which sounds strange that you'd have to invent it, that you need to count where the votes are going to come, which doesn't seem like that much of a surprise, combined with books from like financiers and stuff. I read a book by a guy called Ray Dalio, who's a US investment guy, and he just writes books about his theories on business and life and what have you. And I can sort of combine some of that with my own theories and then realize that often when you're trying to create something new, in this particular case, how you could create predictive models of the way that votes might turn out. So I created a version of statistical analysis for projecting the outcomes of votes, which is not the way that whips in Parliament would normally go. So just to give you a very simple example, so it's probably getting a bit too detailed, but a whip in Parliament would conventionally go, Jimmy, are you going to vote for this or against it? You say you're going to vote for it, and let's say you were going to be believed. You go down on the for side, and they go to the next person. I ignored that. Instead, what I did was come up with a way of saying, you say you're going to vote in favour of it. I'm only 75% sure, because I'm not sure you're totally sure, and anyway, maybe you're going to change your mind. And I'll come up with a percentage chance that you're going to vote in a particular way or carry out a particular action. And then the statistical analysis is on balance. I therefore think that the answer will be this. Disadvantage, I don't know exactly who did and didn't vote. Advantage, I found it to be massively more accurate in predicting an outcome than working out individually what that person's going to absolutely definitely do. And that was actually basically the insight to how I was predicting outcomes of leadership races and assisting in the cases of, as you say, Boris Johnson and Rishi. It's very straightforward. Actually, I think in general, both in business and in government, like you need to be able to explain things on a page. And if you can't, then there's probably a problem with the concept. But if you can't sum the arguments up on two sides of an A4, there's probably something wrong with the policy that's being pursued. Because you've got to be able to explain it in the end to people why you're doing it. This feels very 2013, 14 to me, this conversation. I was party chairman. The polls were terrible. We were in the coalition. Our side hated it. They were bickering with each other. You know, the country was fed up. We'd had austerity. And we were, 15 points behind in the polls then. And again, actually, directly refers back to the previous points we were discussing. What you got to have is sufficient clarity of thought between where you are now and where you need to, where you want to get to, where you want to take the country, and then be able to explain it to people, on one side of A4 or whatever. And, so what I'd say right now, at a very simplistic level, is why are we in this situation? There's lots of reasons, but no small part of it is we suffered a 1 in 100 years, more than 100 year pandemic, which cost us £407 billion, which is a lot of money out of everybody's pockets and makes people feel grumpy. And then we have got into a war in Europe, which has shoved up energy prices, forced up inflation, created an industrial action, strikes environment where everyone is again grumpy, understandably, because no one wants that. So fundamentally, the problems that we're suffering are being replicated by almost every government in power, almost everywhere in the world that suffered from the high inflation. So there's a tendency to think this has all come some sort of mystery in Britain. It's not at all. What people want is, and people I think will accept, is this is difficult. What we want to know is that you lot are, properly minded, with clear thought to sort out these problems. They accept that we didn't invent the war. They accept we didn't invent COVID. How are you going to fix it? And I think that's where Rishi Sunak has the advantage, because he's been Chancellor. People trust him on the economy more, and they like him as a Prime Minister. And I think the rest of it is down to being organised enough as a party and clear enough on the messages. But of course, there's a route through. I'm not saying we definitely win the election, but I'm absolutely saying that we can. Yeah, absolutely. And I was here, as I say, as chairman. What was it, 8 years ago, having the same conversations, and we won in 2015. British people aren't stupid. They realise that the whole world is suffering the same problems, right? And it's easy for us all to feel very grumpy about it. Of course.
What have you used it for?
Well, it told me all the answers to this interview, Jimmy. More eloquently than I can possibly. Just experimenting with it, really. I think it's fascinating that one technology can, write a half-decent essay on anything you ask it to write an essay on. Great limericks and rhymes if you put your name in or whatever. But if you're in the public sphere, I guess. But also can produce a bit of Python to look at the last 1,000 tweets of every MP and pull out when they mention climate change or whatever you want to do. And it does all these things. I mean, it's actually, it's an extraordinary insight, I think, into the next level of technology and AI, rather than necessarily being entirely there at the moment. Yeah, it's interesting, because I remember as a kid going to the Science Museum, which naturally I loved. And they had two things which fascinated me. One were traffic lights that as you approached them, they knew you were there and were able to change. This was the kind of temporary lights that now go routinely when there's an annoying bit of roadworks being done, whatever. It was shown in the Science Museum. Eventually it happened. And then the other thing which I always remember seeing were barcodes. And it was like amazing. One day at the shopping, at the checkout, you will swipe your thing, or they'll swipe your thing. You're like, it'll be amazing. Actually, really what's amazing is just how many decades it's taken. I mean, the barcodes did come in on all products, of course, but it carried on that it was the cashier picking up your thing and swiping it, and then a bit maybe you do it. But the idea that you just remove the cashier and go straight to the barcode, I don't know, it lasts 5-10 years, right? Yeah. It's and actually now in lots of shops, you might find they're pretty much only swipe throughs. And so sometimes the adoption can take a while. I suspect adoption will get faster, much faster with things like AI. I think people, particularly because the internet's been invented in between, ideas therefore spread faster and habits change faster. So, I mean, I often find I sort of pick up these things in a slightly geeky way ahead of time. So I remember I had on my phone contactless payment quite early on, before it went on to Apple Pay and became sort of And I just remember thinking, why won't everyone just want to pay like this in the future? I guess that people will start to work it into the back end of all sorts of applications. So it won't necessarily be that it's the student typing in and trying to get an answer to their project. A nightmare for universities, because whereas you could check for plagiarism quite easily before by running it through a checker, you can't do quite the same thing with AI. But I think it will be less about that. It will be more about how it's integrated back end of a system. So I'm afraid probably in the short term we'll see slightly more frustrating conversations with chatbots on websites where you still don't quite get the answer you wanted even more of the time because they've decided to link it up with an AI backdrop. Will we shop at Tesco? I briefly worked in Manchester after I finished studying at Gestetner, who photocopying type machines, because I knew I wanted to go into printing, and I thought I should get some experience around that market. Actually, probably my phone. It just does everything. I mean, from being a torch to to a radio to a phone, occasionally, to access to the world's entire information on the internet. I mean, it just is the thing that you'd want on a desert island. Oh, plus a battery solar panel to stop it from running out. Quite difficult to fly, actually, much harder than flying yourself, I find, because from an orientation point of view, you're not inside it. Well, obviously, Jimmy's Jobs of the Future is right up there. Actually, I mostly don't listen to podcasts. I mostly listen to books online. Right now, I'm listening to The Last King of America, which is about George III, who, of course, everyone thinks the king who went mad. There's another book which talks about rise and fall of empires, actually. Yeah. It's about how debt has a big part to play in the success of businesses as well as the success of countries. And I think I really like listening to stuff which kind of expands your mind and maybe you don't agree with, but it's very interesting to listen to anyway. Probably The Big Short, because I think it's educational. It was, I guess that's why they call it the blues. It was on tape cassette. So actually, I'm going to give this to an American company that the Brits have successfully enticed here, reversing that usual someone else has the idea and then it goes abroad from Britain. They're a company called Zero Avia. They've managed to fly an aircraft with one of the engines on hydrogen. It's a 19-seater. They did a 6-seater, then a 19-seater, and the next step is to move it up. They're not the only ones doing it, but I think it's very impressive. Oh, can I do a second one? Yeah, of course. Brilliant company called Vertical, who are creating like an eVTOL, one of these sort of helicopter type things. It's entirely electric. Yeah. I think they have about 1,500 orders for these kind of flying taxi sort of things. It's all happening down in Bristol or something down that way. Oh, I see. Like if I wasn't in politics.
Yeah, exactly.
Gosh, no.
Trying to entice.
No, I thought you were sort of. No, I think I mean, obviously, I really enjoy being in politics and in government itself. I mean, I think I would do something which was entrepreneurial and probably something which is not too standard.